Okay, all right, so Phylum Platyhelminthese. When we're talking about Phylum Platyhelminthese, what kind of organisms do we think about? Flatworms, such as tapeworms and flukes and little planarians, the little free-living flatworms that are not going to hurt you. All right. So these are the flatworms, and they're called flatworms because they are what? Flat. Specifically, how are they flattened? What's this way?
Vertically.
What's this way? Dorsal ventrally flattened. All right, they're dorsoventrally flattened. Okay, dorsoventrally flattened, and it honestly, with some of them, it literally looks like somebody's taken an iron and just gone squish. They're dead flat. Just looking at a flatworm tells you an awful lot about its biology and the sort of things that it maybe can do, the lifestyle that it lives. All right, being flat gives it what? What feature, what characteristic, what advantage, I guess? Being flat, what does that do? So it actually can fit in small spaces, but probably if it had the same as a tube, it could probably fit into smaller spaces. So that's one. What property does it give it? What physiological property?
Closer to the surface.
Sorry?
Maybe be more contact with the surface.
What do you mean more contact with the surface?
It's round, only just the very bottom.
Yeah. Let's take a volume that's round and now let's flatten it. Maybe it's the same area in cross-section. This one has a huge surface area compared to this one. Much greater surface area to volume ratio than something that's round. And the distance between its innermost point and the outside is very short compared to the innermost distance here. That tells you an awful lot about it. All right? So, what kind of things can this one do that maybe this one can't? Maybe there's a huge surface area for absorption, much more so than here. What else?
Stick onto things.
Maybe a big area to stick on things, okay? I'm thinking more from a physiology perspective. Big area for absorption, maybe of nutrients. What else? What else have you got to absorb or get rid of? Right. So we've got a huge surface area now to absorb nutrients and what else? Gases like oxygen, yeah? And a huge surface area to release what? Not a trick question. Sorry?
Carbon dioxide.
Maybe gases like carbon dioxide and wastes. Okay? So if you can release them, if you're able to get rid of them by simple diffusion alone, you don't need a circulatory system. So compared to something like this, you might need a circulatory system in order to transport nutrients and gases around the body. Just being flat tells you, maybe they don't need to do that. So if they don't have a circulatory system, when you have a look inside them, now you've just eliminated things like a pump and vessels and so on that are characteristic of a circulatory system. Do you see how you can make those deductions just based on this? All right. Okay, so these are the flatworms then. So they're mostly aquatic. Many of them are marine. Many of them are freshwater or live in damp terrestrial habitats. But the majority of them are internal parasites. Many of them internal parasites of mammals. All right? And other vertebrates. Tapeworms, flukes, and then the free-living, non-parasitic flatworms. Yep.
So if they're acting as a parasite, does it matter which part of the body that they're located? Like does pH affect where they go?
So it does. Now we're going to talk about, I'll talk about the tapeworms and a couple of different flukes, all right? And they are usually quite specific in where they sort of want to go, where they're happy, right? Now I don't mean happy as in, you know, they're laughing, but an environment that's appropriate to their normal growth and development and transmission. And I'll show you what happens when they end up in a place where is atypical for them, all right? So, can the parasitic ones also be happily free living without a host? No. With these guys, you're either a parasite and you need your host, or you're free living and you don't use or need a host. All right. Okay, so Bodyplan then. What's their symmetry? They have bilateral symmetry. Good. And what about their embryonic germ layers? They're triploblastic. They have ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. As adults, do they have ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm? No. All right. They have tissues derived from those structures. Good. But they are acoelomates. There's no cavity, no body cavity. It's quite a primitive condition. All right. So how would you define the phylum Platyhelminthese then? Start with Bodyplan. Bilaterally symmetrical. Triploblastic, acoelomates. Good. Now tell me a little bit about their biology.
Usually parasites.
The phylum, though. What kind of flattening? Dorsal ventrally flattened. Good. All right. Many of them are parasites, but some of them are also free living. Okay. So they're flattened dorsoventrally. They also have a gastrovascular cavity, which says there is one opening that acts as both mouth and anus. Now, some platyhelminths have no mouth at all. If they don't have a mouth, what does that tell you about them? It's all absorption. So if it's all absorption, what does that tell you about their body wall or their outer lining?
It's permeable.
It might have holes. Yeah, it's permeable, well permeable, and there's different ways that you can be permeable. Good. And they're typically, one other thing about exchange surfaces. What's another characteristic of exchange surfaces where gases or nutrients are exchanged? They're nearly always wet or moist. Good. So now that tells you something about where they live. Okay. All right. So they've got a gastrovascular cavity. What does that also tell you about the organism? If it's got a gastrovascular cavity, you say it's efficient or not very efficient? Not very efficient. Ours is a very efficient digestive system. Unfortunately, that's why if you eat 20 donuts, you're going to put on weight because it's so efficient, right? I wish it was completely inefficient. Then you'd eat all the donuts you wanted and you wouldn't get, put on any weight. These guys, quite inefficient. Goes in one way, comes out the same way. So digested and undigested and partly digested food, they all mix. It's not an efficient way. So they don't have an efficient digestive system. What does that tell you about their lifestyle? Sorry? Maybe they're always eating. In fact, they're not. Well, some of them kind of are.
So they live in a nutrient-rich environment?
Maybe they live in a nutrient-rich environment. Maybe they have very low levels of activity. They don't use many calories. All right? Okay. What I want you to do is get you to where you can look at an organism and start to make some deductions about its biology, where it might live, and how it lives. So gas exchange then takes place across the surface area. That means that the epidermis, now there's nearly always a protective cuticle, especially on the parasitic ones. All right? But you still have to have a very permeable epidermis and surface area. All right? And they're typically moist. So they have to also regulate their osmotic balance. That means they've got to regulate their salt and water balance. So they've got to regulate the ion concentration, that's the total ion concentration, and the concentration of specific ions, and also the amount of water. They can't have too much or too little. So if they absorb too much water, they're able to expel some. All right? if their ion balance gets thrown off, they're able to regulate it. In other words, they don't completely track the ion and osmotic concentration of their environment. They do have the ability to regulate it. And they do so with these structures called protonephridia. You can almost think about that. It's not a kidney, but you can think about it as an analogous sort of structure or organ to your kidney, which is the organ that regulates salt and water balance in your body. Protonephridia. What does just the word protonephridia tell you about them? Proto, simple, basic, yeah. There are structures called nephridia, all right, which are a bit more complicated. And they've got some degree of cephalization. There always seems to be this sort of very recognizable head end in the platyhelminths. Now, even if you can't recognize it by looking at the specimen, they'll usually move head first. Right? There are some swimming ones that always swim head first. And we're going to break it down into these three classes. All right? You've got class Turbellaria. They're the non-parasitic, free-living ones, the little cuties, the little planarians. And then a parasitic class of the trematodes. They're the flukes. And then another parasitic class, the cestodes, and they're the tapeworms. All right, so again, we'll do the same thing. We'll go through class by class and talk about their biology. So the first class are the Turbellarians. So these are free-living species, non-parasitic. They don't need a host, but they obviously eat other things. We saw them in lab today. You'll see them in lab on Wednesday. And here's a really pretty marine one. It's a really pretty marine flatworm. Now, there's not much difference, is there, between that left side and right side at the front? But see these little folds? That gives it away that this is the head end. So in that one, that's the full extent of the cephalization. Now, what organism is this flatworm sitting on? Coral, yeah. Right, good. Here's another one. They all seem to be very pretty with pretty colours. Very flat. So I want you to see how they swim. Strong swimmers or weak swimmers? Strong or weak swimmers?
Stronger than jellyfish, but not by much.
I think so. Oh, these ads drive me crazy.
Are you scared?
So look at the way it moves, and you can now sort of get an idea as to what sort of musculature it's got in that thin little body. Wake up. Doesn't that music kind of make you feel good, though? Yeah. You should associate it with this class. They're all like nice, free-living, pretty. They're not out to get you. Okay?
Well, except the ones that want to live in your gut.
Ah, none of these are parasites, though. These ones, this class, right? They're all free-living ones. Yep. All free-living. Yep.
So are any of them toxic?
So I don't know the answer to that question, because that would look like a tasty morsel, and the fact that those colours are so bright, it should be advertising itself, come and eat me, right? So there must be some kind of chemical defence. Typically there are. Honestly, I don't know much about it, but they must be chemically defended. Typically, if you're really soft and obvious, you're chemically defended. Sea cucumbers, chemically defended, soft and obvious. Okay. All right, so class Turbellaria, these are the free-living species. The best known ones are the planarians, and we saw those in lab. And then we cut them up into little pieces. So the planarians are freshwater. The ones we just looked at were saltwater. They were marine. And they prey on other smaller animals. Now, usually if something dies, they'll just find it. They have chemoreceptors on the little lobes on each side of their head. And they use those sensory lobes. They can sort of smell in stereo, right? You can tell where a sound comes from because you've got two ears. They can tell where a smell comes from by the sensory receptors on each side of the head. So they're often doing this backwards and forwards. And then they know where that scent is coming from. They can move towards it. They'll find that organism that just died. And then they'll invert their pharynx. And they'll start to suck up soft tissues. And they'll feed that way. So when you look at them under the microscope, you'll see they've got two eye spots. Now, they're not well-developed eyes, but there are two spots that are light sensitive. All right? Sometimes they're called ocelli. And so again, it knows when it's going towards light or when it's going towards dark. It can detect that. And because it's on each side of the head, then it's got it doesn't really have a brain, it's got a very simple nerve net, but based on more light on one side, it can make decisions about which muscles it's going to contract and therefore which direction it goes. Yeah.
So do those work similarly to the Phylum or whatever you were saying about jellyfish, those little spots on them?
So do they work similarly? You know, honestly, I don't know the answer to that question. They've got to, because they've got light-sensitive cells. So functionally, they're similar. They can detect light intensity, but they can't form an image like you can. But whether at the cellular and sort of physiological level they work the same, that I don't know. That's a good question, but I really don't know. I imagine they do. All right. Most of these light-sensitive cells work by light having an effect on a pigment, some light-sensitive pigment. But there's no brain. There's not a lot of decision-making. Okay. All right. So it's a little more complex than the cnidarians. Their nerve net. They have these nerve cords that run the length of their body, and I'll show you a diagram of that. But again, they don't really have a brain. So they're hermaphrodites. And what do we mean by a hermaphrodite?
Male and female.
It means within the same individual, there are both male and female reproductive parts. All right? They have both testes and ovaries. They're able to make both sperm and egg the individual. That's what being a hermaphrodite is. So they can reproduce sexually, but they can also reproduce asexually by fission. So what is fission? Splitting, yeah. So they can split into two, and that would be asexual reproduction. Okay? All right, so here's the diagram from your book, typical planarian body form. There we've got the eye spots or ocelli. Here are the little sensory lobes either side on this head end. There you've got these nerve ganglia that are concentrated around the ocelli and those sensory lobes, which makes sense. There's a lot of information to process. And then we've got these nerve cords, which run ventrally along the whole length of the animal. And there are fine nerves that branch off from those and obviously connect to muscles and send signals to muscles about how the animal moves. Now you notice on its head end, there's no mouth. The mouth is at the end of this pharynx, which is typically within the pharyngeal pouch and is only extended when it needs to feed. Otherwise, it's withdrawn and pulled in. Okay? And of course, it's hollow. There's a tube. The mouth is sort of quite muscular. The pharynx is very muscular. It sort of moves it all around like this, sucks in whatever food it wants, and that food then is moved to the gastrovascular cavity, which is very, very branched. And we call those branches diverticular. Right? Those branchings, blind endings of the gut where it's very highly branched are called diverticular. They're the diverticula of the gut. Okay? All right. Good? Quite simple.
It is in flatworms like planaria that we first see bilateral symmetry and cephalization, localization of the sense organs in the head region. A pair of ocelli, light-sensitive eye spots, are located toward the center of the head. Lobes extending from either side of the head contain chemosensory cells. Planaria feeds using the protrusible muscular pharynx. The chemosensory cells on the lobes are used to locate the food. Through rhythmic contraction of the muscular pharynx, planaria pumps the food into the gastrovascular cavity with a siphon-like action.
Okay, good. Do you see that? Do you see the pharynx coming out? All right. So now on to a fascinating class, the trematodes. All right, class Trematoda. And these are the flukes. Now these are internal parasites. All right. And they've got a whole range of different hosts, and they've got some really complex life cycles. Oftentimes they'll alternate. You might be the host, and then to complete their life cycle, they need to go into another host. Now, many of these trematodes, the flukes, their alternate host is very often a snail of some kind. Snails act as alternate hosts for these flukes. So they might go from you or their other mammalian host into a snail. It's got a complete part of its life cycle in the snail, and then another stage emerges which gets back to you. In other words, you can't infect yourself. Does that make sense? You've got to go through a snail to be infected. All right, I think we'll wrap it up there and we'll carry on with these next time.